Please pray with me these words of Jesus. Come to me, you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Amen. Are you tired sometimes? Are you weary sometimes and heavy laden? I am too sometimes. That's why I was so moved by this post from blogger Caroline Lewis, who wrote, "Much of what we pay attention to is neither meaningful nor life-giving. Burnouts and breakdowns are not always the result of exhaustion. They are symptoms of passion run dry and waning joy. The answer is not always to work harder," says Jesus. The answer is to allow ourselves rest. Without rest for the weary, nothing gets done and nothing new can be dreamed. Without rest for your soul, eventually your soul will give in to the weight of the world. The world needs a church whose people are responsive, who are rested up, who can see forward because they are revitalized to have vision, which is God's vision. So let's talk about rest and Sabbath this morning. And I don't just mean y'all take a good vacation. I'm talking about Sabbath rather as opting out. A no to the rat race, a yes to God's stunning promises. So, inspired by Walter Brueggemann's book, Sabbath as Resistance, let's talk about the rest God had in mind in the Sabbath commandment on Mount Sinai. Understood in this light, Sabbath was a gift to people in flight. What were they fleeing? Pharaoh, with his insatiable demand for grain and wine and oil and gold, for bricks to build huge storage units so he could amass these treasures. See, Pharaoh's system only worked with enslaved labor. Pharaoh laid the heavy yoke of anxiety and production on Israel's people. And when they could not meet his quota for bricks and yet more bricks and yet more bricks, he made life yet more worse by withholding the straw they needed to make those bricks. And it turns out brick building was hot, and it was muddy, and it was awful. It required folks to work their hands raw, to make their backs sore, and it only worked if they had enough supplies under the brutally hot sun. And it was into this reality that Pharaoh forced the enslaved to gather straw at night so they could make even more bricks during the day. Pharaoh thundered, "Let heavier work be laid on you, then you will labor at it. I will not give you straw. Go and get straw yourselves, wherever you can find it, but your work will not be lessened in the least." His words were as relentless as the tick-tock of production, all to consume and produce more, all to try to assuage the deep yearnings of the human heart, for which Pharaoh's system had pathetic little on offer. Lavish gold and jewelry and food and wine for those at the very top of the scheme, cruel dribble for everybody else at the bottom, and everybody else was at the bottom. Indeed, the pyramid was the symbol for Pharaoh's fraying society, falling apart like so many crumbling stones, while Pharaoh clawed for control at the top. Indeed, there was no Sabbath. There was no rest in Pharaoh's land. As Brueggemann writes, it was into this system of hopeless weariness that erupted the God of the burning bush. The reason we find dancing at the end of the Exodus journey is that the life of the Israelite economy is no longer determined by or compelled by the insatiable production quotas of Egypt and its Pharaoh. At the taproot of this divine commitment to relationship and covenant, rather than commodity and bricks, is the capacity and the willingness of God to rest. Indeed, Yahweh calls throughout Egypt land, "Let my people go. And we know Yahweh's Sabbath command was an explicit rebuttal to Pharaoh's scheme, because when those 10 commandments began, Yahweh made something of an introduction. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Y'all remember me? God says. You know me because I'm a God of freedom. Now let's talk about how things are going to be different now that we have left Egypt's land. And then Yahweh worked through the 10 commandments, calling us to rest on the seventh day, because that's precisely what God did. Notice the way God introduces the Sabbath command. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and called it holy. Even in the stunning act of creation, after making literally everything, God took a day off. God rested on the seventh day. And this shows, in Brueggemann's words, A, that Yahweh is not a workaholic, B, that Yahweh is not anxious about the full functioning of creation, and C, that the well-being of creation does not depend on endless, restless work. Make no mistake, Israel had a choice to make right then and right there. They had to either submit to Pharaoh's slavery or accept Yahweh's freedom. But the contrast was stark, and Israel was in the midst of regime change, and Sabbath was the way by which they made their decision clear to God and to each other. By pledging to keep Sabbath, Israel promised to shift away from Pharaoh's kingdom of ceaseless bricks and production demands back to Yahweh's realm, where we rest and care for our neighbors. And neighbors had explicit meaning in the Exodus. It clearly meant, it could not have meant anything else because of the number of times it was repeated, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. Just as Israel had to choose their way at Sinai, so Jesus tells us too that we cannot serve two masters. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, you cannot serve God and mammon at the same time. Brueggemann says the way of mammon is the way of commodity, of endless desire, endless productivity, endless restlessness without any Sabbath. And Jesus taught his disciples they could not have it both ways. It was either one or the other, Pharaoh's way or God's way. Indeed, anxiety is contrary to the trust Jesus asks of us in today's gospel. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The word learn from me comes from the same Greek word for discipleship. So when Jesus says, come to me and take my rest, he's talking about a central task of discipleship, which we are agreeing to today with and on behalf of these three incredible babies, Tegan and Alexandra and Esmeralda and their parents. It's so good to be with you. Brueggemann says, weariness and being heavy laden and yoke, these are all ways of speaking of the commodity society of endless production. But Jesus offers an alternative. Come to me and rest. Indeed, Sabbath is a practical divestment, so that neighborly engagement rather than production and consumption defines our lives. To cease, even for a time, the anxious striving for more bricks is to find ourselves with his light burden and his easy yoke. It is now as then enough to permit dancing and singing into an alternate life. So when we keep Sabbath, it's an explicit rejection of the ways of the world. It is a no to the culture of anxiety and coercion. Sabbath is a yes to God's abundant promise of life, love, and freedom for all. When we keep Sabbath, we are saying no, we are opting out, we are resisting anxiety. In Jesus' words, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body or what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and is not the body more than clothing? And can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your span of life? This is why Sabbath was so critical. It was at once a no to anxiety, but also a no, an opting out, a resistance to coercion. Back in Exodus, we read, observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. As the Lord your God commanded you, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh is a Sabbath day unto the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. All your household shall rest, as well as you. And here the words, as well as you, form a critical addition, because Yahweh calls everyone to rest. Everybody, equally. As Birmingham says, Sabbath is the great day of equality when all are equally at rest. Not all are equal in production. Some make more, some make less. Not all are equal in consumption. Some buy more, some buy less. But Sabbath breaks that all down. Because on the Sabbath, you do not have to do more. You do not have to sell more. You do not have to buy more. You do not have to have your kids or your grandkids in ballet or soccer. You do not have to be younger or more beautiful, because this one day breaks the pattern of coercion, and all are like you, equal, of equal worth, equal value, equal access, equal rest. And so it is that Sabbath becomes a festival of freedom. Ho, cries the prophet Isaiah. Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and you that have no money, come, buy and eat, buy wine and milk without money and without price, standing in stark contrast to a world that insists with frightening certainty that lunch can never be free, and leads to a key question for Sabbath takers. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me, says the Lord, and eat what is good, and delight yourselves. And Brueggemann asks, why indeed? Because Pharaoh looms large in our cultural imagination, but he need not. God said in Egypt land, let my people go, and the last time I checked, we left Pharaoh in the dust. And in this light, Sabbath is a way of opting out, of saying no to the world of consumption and yes to the God of compassion and rest. Brueggemann finally, Sabbath provides time, space, energy, and imagination to recognize that more commodities which may be acquired in the rough and ready of daily economy finally do not satisfy, and they never will. Sabbath is the regular, disciplined, visible, concrete yes to the neighborly community loved by God. So let's give ourselves permission to rest this summer, to take Sabbath rest, to find some extended time away, to take work email off our phones. I'm looking at my clergy colleagues. I'm talking to myself. Maybe even to turn off our phones to be sustained and healed by creation, by family, by friends, by sleep. Because indeed God has work for us to do, but God has rest for us to take as well. And it need not just be an annual tradition, for God calls Sabbath every 7 days. To paraphrase Rabbi Abraham Heschel, Sabbath does not happen and will not happen because our work is done. Our inboxes will never be empty. Our checklists will never be blank. Sabbath happens simply because it's the seventh day, and on the seventh day God rested. So too can we. Amen.